No legal commentator on cable news is more energetic, constitutionally minded, or libertarian than Andrew Napolitano.
But censorship is a very dangerous business.
Who has served as Fox News' senior judicial analyst for nearly 2 decades. A former New Jersey Superior Court judge, Napolitano is a nationally syndicated columnist. You can read him regularly at Reason.com, and the author of a shelf full of books about law, history, and race in America. Reason caught up with the judge at FreedomFest, the annual event held every July in Las Vegas. We talked about Donald Trump's ongoing makeover of the federal judiciary, whether Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh will be good for the libertarians, what it's like to be an ex-Republican, and the imminent return of Freedom Watch, the popular and controversial show that Napolitano hosted on Fox Business from 2006 to 2010. Judge Andrew Napolitano, thanks so much for being on my show.
The one man I want to question me. No holds barred. A pleasure, Nick. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
The topic of the day is Brett Kavanaugh, Supreme Court nominee. A lot of people, particularly on the right among libertarians, are pretty happy with this pick. You don't hold as high opinion of him as
well, I hold a high opinion of his academic credentials and of his intellect, but not of his values. My candidate on that list would have been Senator Mike Lee, who was the only legitimate, qualified libertarian that was on the list. Also the only non-judge on the list. I was very disappointed with the appointment of Kavanaugh because I believe that he comes from the heart and soul of the Washington establishment. So if you like the people that run Washington, D.C., no matter which party is in power, you call them the establishment. If you don't like them, you call them the swamp. So when the president was Mr. Donald Trump, he was calling this crowd the swamp. Now he calls this crowd the same human beings, the establishment. They are the ones that thrust Judge Kavanaugh upon him.
But yeah, come on, you're saying he's part of the establishment. He went to high school with Neil Gorsuch at Georgetown Prep. He's got 2 degrees from Yale, lived in D.C. most of his life, works in D.C., and that's a problem?
Yes, that's the
now,
problem.
Explain why that is.
That is not the fresh blood that Donald Trump promised. But I'll give you 2 examples, and they both involve the Fourth Amendment. But he believes that the Fourth Amendment does not apply to the NSA, that it only applies to law enforcement, meaning that America's domestic spies, generally called the NSA, there are other domestic spying agencies at the president's disposal, can capture our keystrokes and our telephone conversations and our whereabouts without a search warrant, because he, in his very narrow, without historical precedent, but influenced by recent events, view of the Fourth Amendment, it only applies to evidence that's going to be introduced in court. So the police can spy on me if they're not going to introduce that evidence into court. In Brett Kavanaugh's world, the NSA can spy on me and you, and are doing so now because there's at least 3 iPhones in this room. You can't turn them off. So they're recording, if they want to listen, they're recording what we're saying. And he sees no impediment to that. He has a similar view of the Fourth Amendment with respect to law enforcement, and that is bending over backwards to find creative ways for to justify police excess. So if the police plant a GPS device on your car to see where you're going, he would have no problem with that, even though the Supreme Court invalidated it.
Yeah, and he would say you don't need a search warrant, you don't need this, you don't need reasonable suspicion.
Correct. I mean, this stuff has got to be turning Madison in his grave. I mean, one of the great linchpins of the American Revolution was the Stamp Act and the Writs of Assistance Act. Abbreviated, you had to have a stamp on every piece of paper in your house, and British soldiers did not need a warrant in order to get into your house. These two
to make sure that the stamps were on everything in the house.
Correct. It cost more to enforce this legislation than was generated in tax revenue. Now, George III was stupid, but who would have a tax that costs more to collect than you actually collect, unless the purpose of it was not to collect money, but to remind the American colonists that the king could come in their house whenever he wanted. So this issue of privacy has been front and center and was front and center with the framers and needs to be front and center today. And Brett Kavanaugh is on the wrong side of it.
How does, so he's terrible on kind of Fourth Amendment and police power or police search, seizure, various defendants' rights issues. He's good on things like the administrative state. He seems to be interested in saying to bureaucracies and agencies, no, you don't get to set your own rules. Congress does that, and you can't just make them up. Like we'll say, if you overreach, that's invalid. We're going to make Congress do something.
So here's his argument on the administrative state, and with one exception, I agree with him. And this is an argument rejected by Justice Scalia and accepted by Justice Gorsuch. The statutes today create the administrative state. The Food and Drug Administration, the Environmental Protection Administration, the Securities and Exchange Commission. The theory is that they're populated with experts who can regulate minutely certain areas of the law that is generally beyond the congressional intellect. If you'll pardon those two words together, congressional and intellect.
I just had a mini stroke.
Right.
Yes.
And the statute basically says that when they write a rule, they enforce the rule and they interpret the rule. So let's say you want a mud puddle in your backyard and the EPA decides it's navigable waters, and therefore you cannot dry it up and you have to protect it and you can't build anything around it. And you challenge that rule. The challenge goes before an administrative law judge who works for the EPA. They wrote the rule, they enforce the rule, they interpret the rule. You lose, you then sue them. This is where Judge Kavanaugh's view and Justice Gorsuch's view comes in. The statute says you do not enter court as equals. You enter court with the court giving a presumption of validity to what the EPA did. The Gorsuch-Kavanaugh non-Scalia rule is that's absurd. There's no reason for us to defer to them. You come into a federal court, you are equal. On that I agree with him. My problem is there is one administrative agency that he arbitrarily exempts from that. The NSA.
Yeah.
Back to where we started.
Yeah. Well, and I guess that answers my next question in a way, but I was going to ask you how when you think about the law and a Supreme Court justice, how do you say, okay, well, what is the most important thing? So he's great on 9 things out of 10, but then the 10th thing has to do with Fourth Amendment, so he's out? Or how do you, what's your personal philosophy of equilibrium?
If I'm the president, I'm looking for someone more like Gorsuch. So I'm looking for someone who believes in the primacy of the individual over the state. Now, Gorsuch is the only one that believes that way. Clarence Thomas, to a certain extent, that our rights are truly natural, that they don't come from the government. That's not an academic argument, because if our rights are natural, the president can't take them away and the Congress can't take them away. The courts can only recognize that we have waived them. The bank robber waives his right to freedom when he breaks into the bank and steals the money. But the legislature can't declare him a bank robber, or the president can't declare him a bank robber because they think he's going to break into the bank because his freedom is natural. If he were on the same page as Justice Gorsuch on the primacy of the individual, he would probably come out the same way that I would on many of these issues. But he's not. I don't know that the president got into the weeds with him on that. The president knows he's pro-life, pro-gun, pro-police. Just those 3 are enough to sell to this president's base. And of course, I am with him on 2, pro-life, pro-gun, but I'm pro-Fourth Amendment.
Would you say that Trump, one of the arguments that a lot of his supporters push forward is that regardless of all the other stuff, and he's terrible on trade, he's terrible on immigration, I think we agree on that.
Oh, yes.
He's terrible, he's not as good on foreign policy. One would hope that he would be less interventionist and less bellicose.
Yes.
But he's remaking the federal judiciary in a way that is consistent broadly with a kind of libertarian perspective. Do you think that's valid? Or
I think it's valid that he's remaking the federal judiciary with an eye toward ideology far more than any Republican president in your lifetime and mine, including Ronald Reagan. I'm going to use this phrase, even though it's a criticized phrase. The litmus test that's applied during the process of becoming a federal judge really is an ideological one today. So they're interested in those 3 issues: pro-life, pro-gun, pro-police. I wish it were pro-life, pro-gun, pro-constitution, or pro-Fourth Amendment. So is he putting people like Randy Barnett or yours truly on the court? No, he's putting more traditionalist conservatives who will support that mantra of pro-life, pro-gun, pro-police.
On that list that was pulled off of ideas from the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation, Mike Lee was the only libertarian candidate who was qualified who was on that list. What would make Mike Lee a great Supreme Court justice?
Well, Senator Lee is an intellectual. I guess I'm going to reveal a secret here, although I've said it publicly. But he and I text each other almost every day, and we often split ideological and almost theological hairs. I know
what about
a
emojis?
great deal about his
intellect. Do you use
intellect.
a lot of emojis in those texts?
I don't.
What is Mike Lee's favorite emoji?
I don't use emojis, and when they come to me, I don't even know what they are. He sent me something with a water skier the other day. I don't know what that was supposed to be. Then it turned out he was the water skier. He has a serious intellect. He clerked for my Princeton classmate, who's a bedrock of conservatism on the court, Sam Alito. And still my friend.
So are you a New Jersey exceptionalist here? You're mad that more people from Maryland are on the Supreme Court, and with Scalia leaving, and now it's just Alito, right?
I wish there were more people who believe in the primacy of the individual over the state, who recognize natural rights, and who take seriously this. If the government derives its powers from the consent of the governed, do you know anybody that has consented to the government? Suppose I vote for the people that lose. If I consented to the government that's in power, this is not just an academic argument. This is the linchpin of the Declaration of Independence.
But how do you square that then without loosing mere anarchy on the world?
You can't change it today.
Yeah.
Without some sort of gradualism. But to me, the only valid role of government is to enforce people's natural rights. That's to Jefferson also. But thanks to the Civil War and the Progressive Era and the New Deal and LBJ and everybody since him, we're into this monster government, which Ayn Rand called an inversion. An inversion, because the government that Madison gave us, we knew everything about the government, and they knew nothing about us. Now they listen to every phone call we make, and they operate largely in secrecy. The government needed its permission our permission to tax and regulate us. Now we need the government's permission to do almost anything. Look around this room. It's almost impossible to find something that's not regulated by the federal government, including the dye that's turned this, whatever it is, red.
I'm going to give you an opportunity to give a spiel for your alma mater, law school, Notre Dame. Is that where you really went deep on natural law or higher law theory?
Justice Gorsuch and I, in different eras and at different schools, were fortunate to study under John Finnis, Finnis, who, along with Robbie George of Princeton, are the leading academic lights on the natural law in the world today. John Finnis was at Notre Dame when I was there. He was at Oxford when Justice Gorsuch, young Neil Gorsuch, was at Oxford. Judge Amy Coney Barrett and I studied under the same brilliant scholar of the natural law, of American constitutional law and American jurisprudence, the late Professor Charles Rice. Charlie Rice was on the Reagan shortlist of 5 from which Justice Scalia was chosen. Professor Rice, Nino Scalia, and 3 others. Charlie Rice had a profound influence on Judge Barrett and on me on the natural law. And the natural law teaches that we can discern right and wrong, and we can ascertain the truth by the exercise of reason, and we don't need the government. It also teaches that our rights come from our humanity and not from the government. You can accept that teaching whether you believe we are creatures of an all-knowing God, you know I'm pre-Vatican II, or you can accept that teaching whether you just recognize that we are the highest, strongest, most effective rational beings on the planet.
How does that apply then when you get to a theory of governance? That would just mean, what, 90% of contemporary government at all levels would disappear? Because
Yes, which is why it couldn't happen overnight, because that would, I guess it was T.S. Eliot, unleash the forces of anarchy.
T.S. Eliot was a fake Catholic. He was an Anglican. He was a JV Catholic, Judge. I don't know. Isn't there a Catholic poet that you could be?
Okay, but I got to tell you, when we did the research, it turns out that Ray Kethledge, who was the most libertarian of the final 4, is a high North American Anglican. So somebody at Fox said to me, "What the heck is that?" I said, "That's more Catholic than almost any Catholics you'll find, particularly with Francis and the papacy." Maybe I should have said that, but I do love T.S. Eliot, but the fear of anarchy being loosed upon the world. If this attitude, which is essentially that the government can only do what the Constitution authorizes it to do, that's Madisonian. That doesn't really change. Take the Civil War out of it because people were killing each other. That's the attitude of the government up to Woodrow Wilson. From Wilson on forward, it's the opposite. The government can do whatever there's a popular will for it to do, and its prohibitions are just those express prohibitions in the Constitution. That, too, is an inversion. That was 100 years ago. If you were to rewrite that inversion overnight, there would be, Eliot or not, anarchy loosed upon the world.
So how do you do that? Put on not your judge hat, but your kind of politician hat or your policy. How do you start rolling that back in a way that doesn't immediately either cause so much social unrest there's a problem, or the people, the opponents of rolling back the state we live in now, really muster their forces, get their army of orcs or whoever, and just shut everything
Well, there'd
down?
be tremendous resistance to rolling it back. The government employs so many people. The deep state, against which candidate Trump railed until he appointed one of the foremost in their number to the Supreme Court earlier this week, basically has such control over so many aspects of our society. Law enforcement, diplomacy, finances, the Fed, intelligence, military, that the resistance would be unbelievable. So I don't know that this could happen in your lifetime or mine or the lifetimes of people watching us now, other than by a revolution. Now, if you said to Yeltsin, really ever going to get rid of Eastern Europe? Those countries, or Poland is someday going to be free after what's happened in the past 70 years? Hey, stranger things have happened.
You, for a long time, were a Republican, or you may still be a registered Republican, but you haven't voted for a Republican candidate for president, by your own admission, since Ronald Reagan. I think it's clear to anybody who's familiar with your work why you are not, simpatico with the Republican Party. Tell me emotionally, what is it like to grow up as you were a Goldwater Republican, you believed in this, and that revolution seemed to happen between Goldwater to Reagan. What is it like when you look at the Republican Party now and it's like, this is my trot?
So I'm a registered Republican where I reside in Northwest New Jersey. A lot of my friends in and out of the government are Republicans, and I vote in the Republican primary, and I obviously vote in the general election. But I haven't voted for a Republican candidate for president since Reagan. I have voted for the Libertarian candidate because the National Republican Party is just a mirror image of the Democratic Party. Both parties want to stay in power. Both parties want some sort of welfare, whether it's individual welfare or corporate welfare. Both parties love war. Both parties love taxes. Republicans love deficits a little bit more than taxes, which is basically taxing the future. So the Republicans no longer stand for what Goldwater argued in '64 and what Reagan argued in '80. Now, Reagan, in my view, was just as co-opted by the people around him as President Trump has become with respect to the appointment of Judge Kavanaugh. So the Reagan of 1988, with the exception of some wonderful things he said, was a different human being than the Reagan of 1980. That argument that he made in the third paragraph of his inaugural address, he would never make at the end of his term. That argument was, let me remind you that the states formed the federal government and not the other way around. Now, of course, if I had been the scrivener, I would have added, and the powers that the states gave away, they can take back. He didn't say that.
What would have to happen for the Republican Party, or who are the people in the Republican Party that would have to dominate it to get your votes back?
I don't know that these are the right people because of personality and leadership, but certainly their ideas of Ron Paul, Rand Paul, Mike Lee, sometimes Jeff Flake. These are a distinct minority in the Republican Party. And quite frankly, Nick, I don't know where the Republican Party is going. There may be no Republican Party. There may just be a Trump Party because he is willing to rid himself of longtime traditionalist Republicans when they publicly disagree with him. And he seems to command enough support from the base that he believes he can get away with that. It's a very interesting phenomenon. And the Democrats seem to be going farther and farther left. I had an interesting experience. I did something, you know why I'm laughing in a minute. I did something I've never done in my life. I testified before the Senate. I testified before the Senate Homeland Security Committee against the Corker-Kane bipartisan proposal to expand the president's war-making powers. And a senator, not on the committee, showed up to grill me. This senator was not aware of my opinions. He was just aware of the F-O-X on my forehead.
Who was the senator?
At the end of the grilling, he said to me in his, though he doesn't represent New York, Brooklyn accent, "Oh, Judge Napolitano, are you still employed by Fox News after this performance?"
So it was Bernie Sanders?
It was Bernie Sanders, who ended up hugging me. Of course, my bosses were thrilled at the photos of Bernie and I hugging each other. But it is an example. Only 2 Republicans showed up who agreed with me, Rand Paul and Mike Lee. All the other interrogators were Democrats who were ecstatic at what I was saying, that there's something called the separation of powers. And the Constitution says the Congress declares war, not the president. And this piece of legislation will let the president declare war, even against the domestic organization, and then Congress could undeclare it, after he's buried them into smithereens. That was the argument. It was a lot of fun.
Does Brett Kavanaugh get confirmed?
Yes. I mean, this would require, there's some odd stuff coming out about his personal finances. This would require really odd personal things to come out. Rand Paul has gone from a no to a I'll have an open mind. Susan Collins has gone from a no to I'll have an open mind. John McCain's not going to vote, so they will need every single Republican, and they probably have a few Democrats to spare. And who knows? People change. Ask those pro-life judicial nominees, Sandra Day O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy and David Souter, what happened to them when they got on the court.
Judge, as a final question, you're at FreedomFest. You are going to be making a pretty fantastic announcement about a new development. What is that?
Freedom Watch, you remember that show because you were on it, that I had on Fox Business, is coming back to Fox.
Do we have a timeline for that?
Probably before Thanksgiving, Nick. I can't tell you how excited I am about it.
Okay, so Freedom Watch is coming back. This was just one of the most fantastic shows when it was on Fox Business. You went to places that most people were afraid to even think about. What are your hopes for the show? What are you going to be doing? What are the issues that are foremost in your mind?
The issues of human freedom and how the government, no matter who runs the Congress, who runs the White House, who's on the court, continues to wear away at our freedoms. I mean, if I could short circuit this, very, very similar to the Freedom Watch that you and many people listening and watching us now knew and loved and lamented the departure of.
That is something to watch out for and really look forward to. Thank you so much, Judge.
You're welcome.
For Reason, I'm Nick Gillespie.